Welcome back to America Decides. Thanks for hanging out with me. The deadline to register to vote in presidential elections, well, it's already passed in more than a dozen states. Here's what we know. Millions of newly registered voters are going to participate in all likelihood at this election. The data firm TargetSmart has tallied more than 17.8 million voter registrations since the 2022 midterm elections. Nearly half of these registrants are Democrats, about a third Republicans. Nearly 17% list themselves as unaffiliated. Tom Bonier joins us now. Tom is a senior advisor at that political data organization, TargetSmart. And as I've said before, Tom is a Democrat. Anyone can figure that out. But the data are the data. And that's what we want to dig into. And I also want to let everyone know, the things we're going to be talking about are not predictive. They are pieces of evidence that may lead us to understand things on Election Day better. But they are not in any way conclusive. But what does registration data tell you, not only since 2022, but since Kamala Harris became the Democratic nominee? Is there anything worth focusing on there?
Yeah. I mean, the reason that data is so important, as you say, it's not going to tell us who's going to win, but the polls are telling us that the race is very close. I don't expect to see anything between now and Election Day that will change that. It's going to be a close election. So the question is, who's going to come out? Where is the intensity? Where is the enthusiasm? The polls aren't always very good at capturing that element. And so voter registration data has historically been a pretty good predictor of which groups are surging in intensity. And so, you know, as you showed there, there's a Democratic advantage. Most of that, if not entirely, has come after July 21st when Vice President Harris became the nominee. Frankly, before that, Democratic registration didn't look that great. Republicans were out registering Democrats. You really saw a switch flipped at that point, and you've seen Democrats have a pretty significant advantage over that time period.
Let's talk about early vote. We're starting to get some early voting in. There are inferences, ladies and gentlemen, that can be drawn from that, but that's all you can do, draw inferences. And people who are professionals in this look at early voting data basically to say who's still out there to be persuaded, and that's about all the conclusions they draw. But are there things that you see in early voting data, for example, in Michigan that might be interesting or potentially relevant?
Well, I've spent a lot of time looking at Michigan for obvious reasons. And again, same with the voter registration. It's a question of where there's intensity and enthusiasm. Because again, polls will tell us how people are going to vote, but not who's going to vote. So the early voting is sort of the other part of that equation, where, as you said, your caution is very warranted. It's not going to tell us who's going to win, but it's good breadcrumbs. In Michigan, what's remarkable to me is the very high turnout in the early vote data among black voters. We're comparing this to the turnout 4 years prior, and what we're seeing is an actual increase of a few points in the share of early voters who are black voters. It's coming primarily out of Wayne County and Detroit. Remember, President Trump made some disparaging comments last week, so it was sort of timed, probably from the perspective of the Harris campaign, almost perfectly. It's overwhelmingly older black women who are turning out there at much higher rates than we've seen before.
Anything to note in Pennsylvania via the early vote? Pennsylvania
is interesting to me sort of for the opposite reason. We know that Democrats have dominated the vote by mail. They did that in 2020, where they won by almost a 3-to-1 margin, the mail votes. That used to be a big Republican advantage. Donald Trump really convinced his supporters in 2020 that it was a fraudulent way of voting.
Which it isn't.
It is not, to be clear. Republicans have done a lot of work trying to clean that up since then, including Donald Trump himself is now encouraging his supporters. So you've actually seen an increase where there were 16% of the mail vote at this point 4 years ago. They're up to 24%. So it's an increase, but it's also not quite where they would want it to be at this point, I imagine.
Anything interesting in Georgia? We were just talking with David Becker about 2 historic days of early voting in person in Georgia.
Yeah, just massive turnout. I mean, number one, if we had a question about whether or not voters are highly engaged in this election,
and enthused, answer so far in Georgia, absolutely.
Yeah, very high turnout. And so in terms of actual demographics, what we know that Georgia is a very diverse state. For Democrats to win there, they need high turnout from voters of color. We look at the share of the electorate that is white as generally an indicator of where things are going. What we've seen when we compare the early vote so far to where it was 4 years ago at this time, you're seeing the white share drop by about 1.5 points. So you're seeing more intensity and enthusiasm from voters of color so far. Very early, as you said, this is just the end of the second day. A lot more data to come, but probably some signs that the Harris campaign is at least cautiously optimistic about at this moment.
Tom Bonier called them breadcrumbs. I would say very tasty indeed. Tom Bonier, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.